In this lecture, I'm going to be trying to understand what happened to prompt the collapse suddenly of that seemingly impressive edifice, the Soviet Union, a state which many American commentators thought was going to remain for the foreseeable future as late as 1988-89. And map the process from the nuclear reactor explosion at Chernobyl, subject to one of the pictures on this slide, to the coup in front of the White House, the Russian Parliament building, in August 1991, just a few years later, which effectively marked the end of Mikhail Gorbachev's rule and the end of the Soviet Union. In considering this, I'm also going to be letting the slides, as far as possible, speak for themselves. There's lots of information in the slides. What I'm going to be trying to do is pick out what are the key variables, what are the key factors which might explain why history is moving in the very particular and very rapid direction we see over this compressed period at the end of the 1980s. The Cold War had reached one of its episodic peaks at the end of the 1970s in what's sometimes termed the Third Cold War. The Soviets had deployed SS-20s in Eastern Europe, and the West, NATO, responded by deploying Pershing and cruise missiles. It's the high point of C&D in Britain, for instance. There's also the Cold War on a global scale going on. The Soviets had intervened in sub-Saharan Africa in places like Mozambique and Angola in the 1970s. Most fatally, in 1979, they got drawn into a conflict in their near abroad to shore up the communist regime which had emerged after the overthrow of the king in Afghanistan, a quagmire which was to drain the Soviets for the remainder of the 1980s. So when Leonid Brezhnev died in 1982, the Soviet Union continued to look like the West's indomitable Marxist antithesis. It was also still very much wedded to Brezhnev's 1968 doctrine, promulgated in order to justify the intervention in Czechoslovakia, sending in the tanks to crush the Prague Spring. His successor, but two after the brief reigns of Andropov and Chernenko, was, however, someone who did not subscribe to or maintain Brezhnev's doctrine. Mikhail Gorbachev, pictured here, is the man who came to power in 1985 and who adopted a rather different approach to the management of his state and indeed to the management of the Cold War. Which brings us on to what do we see as the factors? At the same time as Gorbachev comes to power, you have an enthusiastic response from those ardent Cold Warriors, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. So one way of thinking about it is, do we see the Cold War being actively won by the West, by the pressure that NATO, led by the Americans, puts on the Soviet Union in order to crush it economically rather than militarily? Or is it internal factors? And here we might look at 4 main factors. One is economics. Fundamentally, the state that Brezhnev presided over was one which looked rather more impressive than it actually was. Economically, it was rickety, it was suffering from high rates of inflation, it was increasingly dependent upon imports, including of foodstuffs, not least from the Americans themselves. So it's under economic pressures. It has decisions to make about, does it maintain its existing security policy? Does it, like Stalin and Brezhnev, try to maintain a security classes in the cordon sanitaire created at the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Bloc countries of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe? Then there's a third domestic factor, cultural change. If you're going to see a revolution, if you're going to see states collapsing from within, then in part that's going to be because people believe it's possible to actually change things. That, if you like, the freeze is in the Soviet Union itself, and you need to have a thaw of what you see as the possibilities before you can stage the kind of revolutionary activity that we see at the end of the 1980s. And the final factor, I suppose, which may be one of the driving forces behind that, is the notion of glasnost, the notion of being able to debate things, being able to try and change arrangements. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness and transparency, and perestroika, and opening out to some extent of the tightly controlled Soviet market in order to try and make it more efficient, and in order to get rid of some of the inefficiencies created by massive levels of corruption within that system. This is not the first time these kinds of moves had happened, even in the post-war years. So across the Soviet bloc in the late 1960s, there's something called the New Economic Movement, which sees semi-market reforms being introduced in a number of these countries. Gorbachev, however, takes this much further. The question I suppose we need to think about is, which do we see as being most important as the factors driving change here? Is it the domestic factors, or is it the international factors? Relate not just to what the West did, but also what was happening in the Soviets near abroad. And here those international factors intersect with the kind of domestic factors that I was talking about earlier. Firstly, economic crisis, which in Poland in 1980 leads to a strike wave, leads to the emergence of a major trade union called solidarity, partly in response to workers' victimisation, and which in Hungary leads to a decision by the ruling elites themselves that they need to change the system at the other end of the decade. What we see in these two countries is that at the start of the 1980s, you could still have a firm response to hold down power. So solidarity, which in the course of 1981 demonstrate that they can hold a general strike across Poland, in December of that year, face what is effectively a military coup by General Jaruzelski. He imposed martial law. He claims that Moscow was about to intervene, which almost certainly wasn't true from what we've seen as the documents there, but he uses that in order to impose martial law and disappear people. At the other end of the decade, however, 1988, 1989, both in Poland, Jaruzelski decides that he cannot face down a renewed strike wave once you've got Gorbachev in power, who is definitely not going to send in the Soviet tanks. Whilst in Hungary, you have the decision that we have to start opening borders. We have to try different, more market-based models in order to tackle our problems. That leads to Hungary starting to open its border with Austria, culminating with what was called the Pan-European Picnic at that border in August. And what you can see on the slide here is the memorial to that seminal event. This was important not just in terms of Hungary, but also in terms of the wider Soviet bloc. Lots of German tourists from the DDR liked to go on holiday to Hungary in the summer. In the summer of 1989, these tourists, anticipating that they might actually get a chance to go into the West, started refusing to go back to East Germany. And in August 1989, the Hungarian premier flies to Bonn, then the capital of West Germany, to reassure the Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, that he will not stop them fleeing through Hungary. The result of these changes is a combination of economic pressures and the collapse of the will to hold on to power, is that in the summer of 1989 into 1990, communism in both of these countries is effectively dissolved and they're replaced by new governments. In Poland, the new government is led by Lech Wałęsa, who in 1990 becomes the president, seen here in the summer of 1989 with US President George Bush on his visit to Poland. The flight of East Germans, first of all through Hungary and then through Czechoslovakia, so you ended up with large numbers of East Germans camped out in the embassy, in the grounds of the West German embassy in Prague in the late summer of 1989, also brought a reaction in East Germany itself. Demonstrations began in Leipzig on Monday evenings from the start of September 1989. At first on a small scale, led by members of the Lutheran Church, they steadily grew. They started off by talking about we want to leave, and then they started saying, actually, wir bleiben here, we remain here. But if we're remaining here, we demand change. On the 7th of October 1989, the DDR, East German Democratic Republic, was celebrating its 40th National Day. The celebrations were marred, as far as the regime was concerned, by these continuing demonstrations in Leipzig. Orders were made for intervention to crush these demonstrations. When it came to it, the demonstrations were so large that the military only half-heartedly intervened. This provided the excuse for those in the East German Politburo to replace the aged and ailing hardliner Erich Honecker with an ambitious deputy called Egon Krenz. This did not, however, save the regime. Faced with the continuing pressure, the demonstrations in Leipzig just continued to get bigger, and the same started to happen in East Berlin. Krenz and his comrades decided to issue a change in the movement regulations for East Germans. One of the members of the Politburo, Gunther Schabalski, then either deliberately or incompetently held a press conference on the 9th of November 1989, which just coincidentally was the 51st anniversary of Kristallnacht. And he gave the impression, effectively said, that these movements would be allowed immediately. This was picked up by West German media. West German television stations broadcast it into East Germany. People turned up at the wall demanding to be allowed out. And the border guards, who knew nothing about this, didn't stop them. The wall was effectively breached. The East German secret police, the Stasi headquarters, was stormed shortly thereafter, and the East German Communist Party was dissolved by the end of the year, being replaced by a Christian Democrat government in April of 1990. Something like 1 in 10 of the East German population were informers on their fellow citizens. This meant that there was an enormous amount of records held in the Stasi headquarters, as you can see from this slide, where the people, mostly young people, who had broken into that building are picking through the files and destroying them in the revolutionary moment of 1989-1990. So you have two Christian Democrats, de Maizière in the east and Helmut Kohl in the west, both committed to German reunification. This happens in the course of 1990, and the capital is moved to the reunited city of Berlin. Lots of celebrations, but that doesn't mean that it all goes easily. There's lots of problems with consolidating the new East Germany. not least economically, partly because of the decision to create the new merged Deutschmark at a parity of 1-to-1. With East Germany having been a lot poorer, this leads to a continuing relative poverty and relatively high rates of unemployment in East Germany, which persist down to the present day. Culturally as well, you have the problem of how do you unify Ossis and Wessis within the new Germany. So much for revolutionary change in the Soviet bloc. What about within the Soviet Union itself? Well, simultaneous with the kinds of changes I've been discussing already, we also see the start of the breakup of the Soviet Union itself. Arguably, this starts in the Baltic republics in the late 1980s, and it has a slightly different cause from those I've been highlighting so far. The resurgence of nationalism, which leads to a separatist movement from the Soviet Union into which they've been forcibly incorporated during the Second World War, starts in Estonia with a threatened environmental catastrophe. This leads to the so-called phosphate war in the summer of 1987, and then at the annual Tartu Pop Festival in May 1988, the following year, the festival is enlivened by people singing patriotic songs. In other words, people get mobilized by a cause which separates their interests out from that of the wider Soviet Union, and then the mobilization gets repeated at the popular cultural level. It becomes spread through the singing of Alu Mattisson's 5 patriotic songs, and they then start moving into other forms of massive demonstrations of popular discontent. For instance, the 2 million people who in summer of 1989 form the Baltic Way. Environmental factors were also of significance in neighbouring Latvia, though in this instance it was plans for a new hydroelectric plant rather than the mining of phosphates. But in all 3 Baltic republics, these developments simply acted as a kind of catalyst to which local elites, increasingly conscious or increasingly playing upon a consciousness of national identity, responded in these monster demonstrations, culminating in Lithuania becoming the first part of the Soviet Union to declare its independence in March 1990. This doesn't mean it gets independence. Then there's resistance from Gorbachev, but the resistance in terms of what the Soviet commanders are allowed to do in the face of large and determined crowds is rather different from the bloody scenes that Vladimir Putin was willing to countenance in the Second Chechen War a decade or so later. Nationalism elsewhere in the Soviet Union could take a variety of forms. In Kazakhstan, for instance, the riots which broke out in December 1986 were sparked by resistance to the replacement of the outgoing General Secretary of the local Communist Party, a Kazakh, with a Russian who was parachuted in from elsewhere over the head of the then Premier of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who went on to be the first and long-serving president of Kazakhstan. That also tells you something about what's going on in some of these places. As the Soviet Union starts to look increasingly fragile, you have imitations taking place in terms of nationalist movements. So the Baltic Way is imitated in Ukraine in early 1990, with also doing human chains. And you also have a growing sense that if the Soviet Union may be falling apart, then maybe you, if you're one of the elites, should hold on to the bits you currently control. One of the characteristics of what happens as the pace of change accelerates from late 1989 into 1991 is that the leaders of the various Soviet republics are increasingly inclined to emphasize their own independence of action, if not actual independence, from the control of Moscow. Indeed, to some extent, we can see this emergence of nationalism also happening within Russia itself, not least with the rise of ultranationalist movements such as Pamyat in the late 1980s. The consequence is that it's not so much that the Soviet Union is falling apart from the centre, but it's falling apart from the periphery. It's these centrifugal forces of a combination of nationalism and self-interest amongst the ruling elites, which is helping to drive this process, combined with the unwillingness of Gorbachev to use extreme force to prevent it gathering momentum. To try and contain these growing centrifugal tendencies, Gorbachev negotiated with the leaders of those republics within the Soviet Union who would talk to him, not all of them, what was called the New Union Treaty. This was an attempt to re-establish the Union on a new, more federal, less economically centralized basis. The treaty was due to be signed in Moscow on the 20th of August 1991. In opposition to it, a group of hardline Russian figures decided to stage a coup. The treaty was by no means universally popular anyway. There have been considerable votes against it in some Russian cities, such as St. Petersburg, all of which suggested that this might have been too little, too late, even if it had succeeded. The coup was effectively contained by the actions of the head of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, and the mobilization of troops in order to prevent the takeover of the Soviet Union. But in the process, it also reinforced the position for people like Yeltsin and all his fellow leaders of the republics that they needed to consolidate their position within the republics themselves, because the Soviet Union itself had had its day. Gorbachev remained the head in name increasingly of the Soviet Union until Christmas Day 1991, but by then even Kazakhstan, the last of the Soviet republics, had declared independence. The Soviet Union, in other words, collapses in on itself, or collapses due to these centrifugal tendencies, which reflect a combination over the longer term of economic pressures with shorter term factors such as unwillingness to deploy extreme force and the cultural change which as a result led to people who no longer believed in Marxist-Leninism as a doctrine, people who were increasingly exposed to the ideas coming in from the West through broadcast media and so on, people who were willing to buy into a different way of thinking about how the states they lived in might be organized. All of those things led to, firstly, an emergence of a growing national sensibility in the various republics, and also in train led to the elites controlling those republics to see that it was in their interest to stand at the head of that nationalism rather than resist it. What role did the US and NATO play in all of this? Obviously, figures like Thatcher and Bush, George Bush, the vice president under Reagan, and the president who succeeded him, both of those figures, Thatcher and Bush, saw themselves as having had some kind of role, whether it be covert aid to the Afghans and the bleeding sore that left in the Russian economy and military capability, or the covert support and indeed noisy propaganda support they gave to Solidarity and other such movements. But at bottom, it seems to me that what happens is a series of dominoes that almost wind inwards, and Gorbachev is not someone who is willing to use the levels of force to stop that happening. The result is that as people start turning up on the streets and find that yes, they may be shot, there may be violence, but it's not overwhelming violence, which means they keep on turning up on the streets, they keep on resisting. And in the end, that makes it possible to dream of something which works better than the USSR, an organisation which ends, at the time, largely unlamented, regardless of later nostalgia, in late 1991.